It is now my privilege to welcome our speaker for this evening, Reverend Dr. John Chryssavgis. Born in Australia, Father Deacon John was inspired early on by the spiritual breath of the Divine Liturgy and by the profound understanding that one finds in the theology and spirituality of the Orthodox Church. After completing school in Australia, he studied the sacred science of theology at the University of Athens, in close geographical and spiritual proximity to Mount Athos. At a later time in life, he would spend several months in silent retreat on the Holy Mountain. He prepared his doctoral dissertation in England on patristic theology under the academic and spiritual supervision of Bishop Callistos, who himself delivered the second annual St. Cyril Methodius lecture. Later, he was ordained to the diaconate. Father Deacon John co-founded St. Andrew's Theological College in Sydney, Australia, and he served as sub-dean and taught patristics and church history. He later served as professor of theology at Holy Cross School of Theology in Boston, and currently he serves as theological advisor to the Ecumenical Patriarch on environmental issues. Father John continues to serve patristic theology with his work and his word, learning and teaching through scholarship and experiencing the grace and blessings that are offered by the fathers and mothers to people of all places and times. Tonight, his lecture is on remembering sacred silence, and he will touch on the subtle variations of solitude, silence, and stillness in the letters of Barsanuphius and John. We look forward to a stimulating, inviting, a thought-provoking lecture this evening. So please join me in welcoming Father John Chryssavgis.
It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful to be invited to be a part of this very prestigious lectureship series. Some of the earlier lectures were delivered by esteemed, respected mentors of mine, one of whom is among us. So I'm very touched by that and very, very pleased to be among you this evening. I didn't think I'd make it. I was stuck in LaGuardia for about 6 hours. Not the most exciting airport to be stuck in, and not a very easy airport to be silent in either. I remembered that when I was in Athens, a student, and I had visited just for a couple of days the shrine of St. Nectarios on the island of Aegina, just half an hour or so out of the port of Piraeus. There was stormy weather on the way back, and only in good Greek fashion would the captain of the ship decide on his own that he was going to try and get back to Athens anyway. And of course, those of us that wanted to get back jumped on board. I remember the boat literally being tossed in the air and in the waves. What must have felt was 15, 20 feet up in the air and just landing, crashing down in the water again. Glasses breaking everywhere, doors flinging. And I remember an Athenite monk sitting just 3 or 4 rows ahead of me, not moving at all. As I sat in LaGuardia today, I wondered whether he could do that at LaGuardia Airport. There are 2 questions that invariably arise when discussion centers around the concept of silence. The first relates to the spiritual content, the essence of silence. What is silence? And how do you reconcile it with the noise, the distraction of the modern world, of modern demands? And the second concerns the purpose of silence. What is silence for? How does silence coincide with a more active, more visible ministry in the world? How does the desert connect with the world? How does silence connect with evangelical charity? How do you connect the silence of Mount Athos which a few years ago was described in the English newspaper The Guardian as the perfect detox getaway, with LaGuardia Airport. Well, some of these questions are going to be addressed, at least indirectly, in my presentation this evening. What I want to try and discern with you are the roots of silence, to explore the roots of silence and of solitude and of stillness in the early monastic development, particularly in Palestine, where two quaint figures, Saints Barsanuphius and John, lived during the 6th century. Over the last few years, I've been very privileged to work on their letters, to translate and to study a series of their questions and answers on spiritual matters. Over the centuries, their letters have certainly been widely read, particularly by monastics, and especially on the Holy Mountain, where several of the earliest manuscripts still exist. St. Nicodemus produced the text of their letters in 1816 in Venice and also wrote the life of the two saints. A critical edition was recently published by Source Chrétienne. As far as English translations go, there was the translation of the early part of the correspondence, the first letters by Derwas Chitty in Patrologia Orientalis. A selection of letters were translated by Seraphim Rose from the Russian, and I've been working mostly from the Greek text. I published a few years ago a selection of letters in the popular patristic series published by St. Vladimir's, and the full text of the 850 letters published by the Catholic University of America Press. So let's go back on a journey. Let's travel through time. Let's go on a spiritual pilgrimage of the heart and the mind to Gaza in Palestine, a region that's always been at the forefront of great political turmoil and media attention. The desert of Gaza and Palestine enjoyed a unique historical and geographical status in the early church. It was accessible by sea and land. It was characterized by both remoteness as well as by close proximity to Egypt and the Holy Land. The prophets wandered here, as Barsanuphius says in letter 605. In this desert, Jesus prayed. The seeds of martyrdom were first planted. Letter 254 acknowledges this. And monastics there openly admitted their indebtedness to the pioneering desert fathers and mothers of Egypt, as letter 60 reminds us. No wonder the Palestinian monks offered refreshing wisdom into the subtle movements of the heart. Both the natural topography and the traditional spirituality lent themselves to an intense and influential atmosphere of solitude and silence. Now, monastic life flourished in that region during the 5th and 6th centuries, coming to an almost abrupt end in 638 when Jerusalem fell to Muslim Arabs. We don't know exactly when or exactly why the first of our two elders, Barsanuphius, enters the hilly region of Thavatha, presumably from Egypt, choosing to lead there the enclosed life of a recluse. But we do know that from this position, he offers profound counsel to numerous ascetics who gradually gather around the wise elder as he develops an extraordinary reputation for discernment and compassion. And then sometime between 525 and 527, Abba John, the prophet as he's known, comes to live beside Barsanuphius, the Great as he's known, sharing exactly the same lifestyle. Neither Barsanuphius, known in the tradition as the Great Old Man, or Megas Hieron, nor John, known to us simply as the Other Old Man, or Alos Hieron, neither of them see anyone with the exception of their secretaries. If you wanted their advice, you put down your question, your query, your problem in writing through their secretaries. Barsanuphius is assisted in this process by the abbot of the nearby monastery, Seridos, and John's scribe is the better-known Dorotheos of Gaza. Some 850 letters survive. Fascinating responses to questions addressed in writing to the two old men. Barsanuphius answers normally the more spiritual questions. John tends to offer the more practical advice. And they support one another's ministry. Sometimes they simply say, "Go and ask the other old man." Or, letter 224, "You have already received a response from the great old man. Why are you coming to me?" We have questions posed by bishops, priests, deacons, monks, laypersons, covering a range of topics in the spiritual and the secular life, from personal temptations to interpersonal relations, from matters of emotional support to problems of financial sustenance, from profound theological concepts to queries about taking a bath, questions about instigating legal action or selling property, or how should professors aspire to ambition in their career. A veritable correspondence course in the spiritual life. And for those involved in administrative circles, there are even letters about how to keep accounts. And their humor, their wit, is simply unmatched. There are letters that talk about the ecumenical nature of the region, such as letter 686, where a layperson approaches the elder John and says, "I sell grapes, I have a vineyard, and I make some money. But if I had a wine press, I could actually make more money. I don't have a wine presser. My neighbor has a wine presser, but my neighbor's a Jew. Should I use his equipment?" And Abba John says, "Look, go outside on a day when it's raining. And if it's raining in your field, but not in your neighbor's, don't use your neighbor's wine presser." There's the letter 6, about someone who's praying to God for food. And the brother knocks on the door and says, "Come and have breakfast with me." And the brother responds, "I can't, I'm praying." There's letter 203. Barsanuphius is always deferring, passing the buck spiritually, never wanting to take responsibility, never wanting to assume spiritual responsibility for another. And he says we shouldn't either in the spiritual life. So when people ask him, "I'm asked to give advice to my brother, should I or shouldn't I?" I'm tempted not to, out of humility, but I'm begged to give advice. And Barsanuphius says so beautifully, "Well, look, in the book of Numbers, God spoke even through an ass. Very likely he can speak through you." Questions about superstitions at the time. Can I do the sign of the cross with my left hand? And Abba John says, "Well, I do the sign of the cross over every part of my body, at every time of the day. So when I want to cross my right hand, I have to use my left hand." My favorite is letter 79, where one of the novices in the nearby monastery approaches the great old man and asks him, "As I begin to pray, O great elder, a cold shiver runs down my spine, just at the moment as I begin to pray. Do you think it's the devil? Do you think it's demonic temptation?" And Abba Barsanuphius won't have anything of this. He says, "Go and ask the other old man." Well, the next letter is exactly the same question to the other old man, to John. "As I begin to pray, a cold shiver runs down my spine. Do you think this is temptation from the devil?" And John says to him, "Why don't you check the door first? Perhaps there's a draft blowing." They really are literally unmatched in their wit and in their wisdom. Barsanuphius and John continue, I would say in many ways, incarnate the same principles that were treasured in the early desert of Egypt, especially the Evagrian notion that you will have heard of, you will have read in the Philokalia, where it's preserved, that a monk is someone who is apart from all, and yet who is also a part of all. Genuine silence, genuine solitude connects doesn't separate. So perhaps by not opening his door to the elderly Egyptian monk who wanted to see him in letter 55, Barsanuphius was in fact leaving the door wide open to everyone. Curiously, the elders' invisibility, their inaccessibility, was precisely what made them eminent, extraordinarily attractive to numerous visitors. Possibly influenced by the same lifestyle, the whole community in Thavatha assumed the form of a loose settlement where monks and hermits enjoyed varying degrees of enclosure. And it was perhaps this intensity of solitude and silence that I would say also gave rise to the monastery's social outreach in its workshops, guest houses, a hospital, a church dedicated to teaching lay visitors, a church where even women were welcome. That's something rather exceptional for the period. We don't have any letters addressed by women, but we know that the monastery was in fact very open for its time. And by the way, the custom itself of communicating by letters in writing is, I think, a critical dimension of communication in silence. It serves as a measure of protecting their own silence and of respecting those who approach them. But this evening, I want to draw your attention to some critical, subtle variations on the theme of silence. Distinctions that I recognized conceptually, intellectually, even linguistically before, but I understood far more completely only after spending many hours in the enlightening, refreshing company of these remarkable elders that I think are really quite unique in the tradition. Barsanuphius and John distinguish between solitude, the various phrases katamonas or katithian, or the term kathisma or kelion, and the concept of silence, sigi, or the verb sigan, or siopi, or the verb siopan, and stillness. Translating here the terms ησυχία, or ησυχάζειν, or ησυχάσε. If you come to know, says St. John, what you want from silence, your heart will desire nothing else. So what is it that the heart desires in solitude, silence, and stillness? While the Gaza elders may not always be very precise in the distinctions that they draw, clearly they underline the importance of taking time to examine the various aspects of the heart, the particular principles that govern the heart. In our age of instant communication, of immediate gratification, I think of the number of Blackberries and iPods that were going on at the same time as CNN was blaring news over and over and over again, quite boring news anyway. In this age, it's strange that we seem to know less about ourselves and about the motives behind our actions than about any other subject. Self-knowledge is the very heart of solitude, and it is the basis of silence, and it is the center of stillness. I think that somewhere on that long trail between childhood and adulthood, many of us lose touch with the vital skills that permit us to know ourselves. Part of the problem is, of course, that we set impossible goals, which can only be met by angels. I know when I first set those goals, probably the moment of my graduation from seminary. But the spirituality of the desert teaches otherwise. It certainly taught these Gaza elders that perfection is for God alone. We are called neither to forego nor to forget our imperfection. Strangely, the fragility, the vulnerability of life itself reveals the priority of confronting and embracing our innermost weaknesses. And life has a way of catching up with us, so that we end up looking it in the face anyway. The truth is that God can be discerned in the very midst of every tension and every trial. Barsanuphius and John certainly comprehend the ways of the heart and the wiles of temptation. For them, unless we take that radical step of surrendering familiar connections or comfortable images, we can't even begin to articulate the language of silence. And that, by the way, is part of how they understand the notion of xenitia, or estrangement. It's entering a foreign territory and learning to speak an unfamiliar language. The Gaza elders are aware that while there are as many ways of knowing ourselves as there are human beings, the differences between us are in fact very slight. When we know ourselves, writes Abba John, when you arrive at that point of stillness, you will find rest and grace wherever you happen to be. You take it with you. So let's begin with solitude, which I like to define as the door to the heart. Solitude is that practice, that discipline, that ascesis that allows us the time and the space to become alert to others and to ourselves. It's a prerequisite in the spiritual way. It's a condition of both silence and stillness. In response to someone requesting prayers, Barsanuphius writes, "Brother, do not compel me to speak when I desire to venerate stillness and silence." And to another monk inquiring whether he should accept money in order to feed the poor, Abba John is equally radical, almost uncharitable. "You are to avoid this," he says, I quote, "even if you see someone dying in front of your very cell." That's because both elders know very well how easily love and service may be used as excuses to avoid the inner work of transformation. They recognize how even prayer can become a pretext to circumvent the difficult work of solitude and silence. And that's why Abba John will say, as far as almsgiving, true almsgiving, not everyone can bear this virtue, only those who've reached stillness. And Barsanuphius explains what solitude is all about. Entering the cell is a matter of the soul, he says, of searching it out and gathering our thought from every person. Unfortunately, we tend to confuse self-knowledge with selfishness, with self-absorption. Whereas in reality, self-knowledge leads away from self-absorption towards a sense of forgetting oneself, a phrase that the two elders use over and over again. "Brother," says Abba Barsanuphius, "show complete hatred in order to acquire complete love. Show complete estrangement in order to acquire complete intimacy. Surrender your will in order to perform your will. Put yourself to death in order to give life to yourself. Forget yourself to know yourself. And then, behold, you will know the work of silence." Curiously, while in the church even, in the spiritual life, we encourage the need for knowing and loving others, we less frequently reward the virtue of knowing ourselves in solitude. Barsanuphius reiterates the stark conviction of Abba Alonius in the sayings of the Desert Fathers. "I and God," he says in letter 346, "are alone in this world." And he advises us in letter 359 that being alone and laboring a little is of more benefit to you than doing anything else, or even than being with others. Indeed, we're never less alone than when we are alone. "Brother," says Abba John in letter 832, "you are not alone in your struggle, for there are many others who are struggling with you in their prayers." Knowing why we do what we do facilitates the awareness also of why other people do what they do, and in the end, the acceptance of other people as they are. Narcissism is not too much self. It is insufficient knowledge of our true self. People who are self-absorbed and self-centered normally suffer from too little rather than too much self. You see, we often seek intimacy by facing the wrong direction. Instead of looking inwardly, we turn outwardly toward others. And so the isolation of solitude serves as that first step toward any intimacy or communion with other people. Brother, says Abba John, when you are alone in your cell, examine your heart, and you will discover whence your hardness toward your brother came to you. And that's because intimacy actually begins from within, actually begins with solitude. It reflects the inner world of the heart. It's the solid ground from where we reach others, ultimately even God. According to an apocryphal saying of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas, when you make the two one, and make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the upper side like the underneath, then the kingdom is at hand. So solitude is the great stabilizer. It's like a secret compass in our relationships with God, with others, and with ourselves. It enables us to distinguish between sharing with other people and people-pleasing. They actually use the word anthropareskia, which is certainly to be strictly avoided. Lots of letters talking about anthropareskia. Solitude flows into silence, which is in fact the restraining of the heart from giving and taking, from people-pleasing and other such things, says Abba Barsanuphius. Solitude is about being and not simply doing. It renders the heart attentive, receptive. It smashes the idol of prayer as not working when we do not receive what we want. Prayer does not want. Prayer wanders. Prayer waits. Letter 359. Do not despair at the labor of being alone, and you will find humility. And if you are humbled, you will receive grace. And if you receive grace, this grace will always be with you. Barsanuphius and John are clear about the fact that when prayer is answered, it's actually never in ways that we might expect. God will arrange the matter, says Abba John, but in a way that you do not know. In fact, prayer is answered in ways that transcend, I would say trample, trash our self-reliance that seeks immediate attainment of premeditated goals. And so solitude is hardly identified with selfishness. Solitude dissolves self-centeredness. Solitude is, another phrase, a term in fact that they coin, not reckoning oneself as anything. And another phrase that they like to repeat, not justifying oneself in anything. And so in this way, Barsanuphius and John continually walk a delicate tightrope between the devil of instant glory, their phrase in letter 204, and the blue sea of despair, their phrase in letter 692. They always recommend this balance, not moving to one or another extreme, as letter 314 puts it, but journeying rather in the middle way. And the next letter, 315, neither being bold in one's silence in times of seclusion, nor despising one's silence in times of distraction. That is truly the middle way. But of course, progress in the movements of the heart takes toil and it takes time. We don't change suddenly, magically becoming new people, our old faults forgotten. We can never run away from who we are. We will never escape temptations and passions, our temper, our vanity, our ambition, our fears, our envy, our delusion, our resentment, our arrogance. Barsanuphius advises us in letter 434 never to enter the cell on the pretext of cowardice, but only at the proper time. And St. John adds in letter 481, when you come to silence by ascetic struggle, that's good. But when this is not the way that you come to it, but rather you keep silent out of fear for any turmoil, that is harmful. Ultimately then, the measure to which we're able to acknowledge and accept others will depend on the degree that we can understand and tolerate ourselves. And that's because we are more united to each other through our weaknesses rather than through our strengths. I'm convinced we are more like one another through our shortcomings rather than through our successes. In the solitude of the heart, through common temptations and all too common human tensions, we become painfully aware of what's lacking. And then we're haunted by the absence of love, and then we begin to yearn for the depth of communion. The cell of the ascetic symbolizes that safe haven of the heart where one can always willingly return to discover more and more, day in, day out, of the authentic self, irrespective of how painful an ordeal or how agonizing a struggle this may be. And that discovery, through solitude, eventually becomes the fountain of healing. Embracing solitude in the loneliness of the cell or the soul means knowing what you think, understanding how you behave, and finally accepting others without the need to defend yourself. It's assuming responsibility without the least sense of self-justification or self-righteousness. It is the source of vulnerability and openness, of humility and love. And in that way, in the journey toward vulnerability, solitude connects with the cross, a repeated connection made in the letters. John writes that is when one reaches silence, precisely when one bears the cross. Because people who have been pushed, whether by personal suffering or by difficult circumstance, pushed to breaking point, frequently have a richness of vision that is far less apparent in those with little or no conflict. Indeed, the reality of conflict as a constant and crucial part of life is very difficult to accept. But the way in which we experience that conflict, that tension, that ambivalence, deeply affects how we accept ourselves and others, and profoundly determines the degree of divine grace that we can tolerate in the end. Genuine solitude reminds us that the heart is not a conflict-free zone where we might avoid or ignore the perils of the world, the temptations of the soul. In the cell, says Barsanuphius, we feel pain and compunction. What prevents compunction from coming to you is your own will. If a person does not cut off one's own will, then the heart does not feel pain. In the final analysis, solitude has the capacity to absorb all manner of pain and to transform all kind of temptation and tension into hope and joy. Letter 496. Temptation brings us to progress, and wherever there is good, there also temptation occurs. So do not be afraid of temptations, but rejoice rather, for they are leading you to progress. No wonder the Gaza elders underline the importance of joy. The need to, as letter 10 puts it, rejoice in the Lord, rejoice in the Lord, rejoice in the Lord. Because while we cannot be without affliction, as letter 96 puts it, we have been commanded to give thanks in all circumstances. And it's here that solitude meets service. And the cell opens up to the whole world, and the heart is flooded with joy. Because the saint knows that he or she is not God. And yet with God, all things are possible. Barsanuphius and John know that perfection rests in the divinity, not in our ability or disability to negotiate virtues or vices. The saint is humble because the saint knows about darkness, knows about desertness, and is not ashamed of darkness, is not ashamed of solitude. And so the saint won't shame you. Barsanuphius and John are normally encouraging those who approach them. They embrace them with compassion, not competition. That's not what characterizes them. Compassion, only compassion, no bitterness in their writing, no vindictiveness. The suggestion is not what we find on self-help shelves. Remember Father Vasilios' visit of the abbot of, former abbot now, of Iviron Monastery on Mount Athos, visiting Boston once, and I took him to a bookstore. He was fascinated by the fact, as I was when I first came from Australia, that bookstores would stay open till midnight. And he was fascinated by the number of shelves in the self-help section of the bookstore. He had no idea what self-help could be. Neither would Bartholomew and John, because their suggestion is not so much that we're all okay. I'm okay, you're okay. Their suggestion is that I'm not okay, and you're not okay, but that's okay. It's okay because God loves us. And whenever we deny that reality, we shut God out of our life. But let me turn more briefly now to the next two concepts, to silence first, which I would define as not the door, but the way into the heart. If solitude endows us with a quality of awareness and vigilance, silence educates us in the art of listening and attentiveness. In solitude, the space between us is very important, and so too is the space between our words in silence. So space is critical here. It's always important. Letter 36, silence is always more admirable. Letter 697, silence is always better. Letter 469, silence is glorious above all else. Letter 283, silence is good in every case. Letter 314, silence is more necessary, more beneficial than everything. And traveling around from parish to parish during Holy Week, I would have loved to repeat these sayings to some of the sermons I heard in church. Silence is always better. So physical contact and verbal communication are as much associated with intimacy and love as silence is. That's exactly why Bartholomew claims that silence is demanded of us by God in letter 603. He would never say that about stillness, which is the final stage, a spiritual gift, as he says in letter 94. Solitude provides the space and the capacity to listen to and soak up what another person is saying and conveying. That's because we bring to relationships the same self that we are or are not in touch with when we are alone. Indeed, the two elders harshly rebuke those who complain about losing the spiritual gift that they attain in solitude, the gift, for instance, of silence, when they happen to be with other brothers. They're rebuked harshly. Silence is a skill whereby we acknowledge that what is going on in someone else's world matters. Otherwise, the river of connection between me and you will render the force of my own desires and prejudices more conscious in my mind and my heart than yours. And as a result, I create my own version of you, with little, if any, chance of contact or connection or communion. Where there is an impoverished self, there is also an endangered relationship. Listen to the old men. Another Christ-loving lay person, that's how they always talk about lay people, asked the same old man, John, sometimes I happen to be in conversation with someone, and suddenly my thought is distracted. How familiar. So that I feel I am alone, and ultimately I forget what that person is talking about. Not because my intellect is transferred elsewhere, but because it is beside itself. I would have loved to translate that. Full of itself. John replies, that's a diabolical temptation. But if you at least openly reveal this to the other person, saying, forgive me, I was distracted, then the devil is put to shame and the temptation will cease. And then you may continue the conversation with vigilance. Now, Bartholomew and John are also well aware that in order to achieve self-knowledge, we need to trust at least one other person. From this, you may learn if you are living like the others in the monastic community, letter 250, by not doing anything of your own will, eating neither alone nor with the brothers of your own accord, but doing whatever you do, whatever you are ordered, without any discord. Letter 324, doing something through the abbot is always a lesser wrong, but doing something alone always brings a double warfare, not only from the heart, but also from other people. I always remember that letter when I'm struggling to remember why I'm obeying a particular bishop. Because obedience is essentially an act of listening attentively. It's the art of listening closely, which is exactly what the Greek word akoi means. Barsanuphius is certain that, in letter 93, when you hasten to do something on your own, then the resulting silence is from the devil. In brief, the basic advice is almost reminiscent of good old British schoolboy etiquette. Letter 698, never speak before being asked. But the goal is different. The goal is not to repress the will, it's to stabilize the will. Again, the same letter. Neither feel arrogant if your words are accepted, nor feel grieved if your words are rejected. But obedience is the measure, the criterion of authentic solitude and silence. If you want to learn whether you are being hurt or benefiting by staying alone, says Abba Barsanuphius, then adopt this as your sign. If you are staying there as a result of obedience, you can be certain that you are benefiting. Of course, the fine balance between isolation and intimacy is ultimately impossible to attain without divine grace. And so authentic silence and stillness are also a reflection of the fellowship that exists in the Holy Trinity. And the two elders make this connection in their letters. Moreover, this fine balance between isolation and intimacy is extremely difficult to sustain without bearing everything, sharing everything with a spiritual director. Because through someone else's belief in ourself, we begin confidently, that is to say, by the act of confiding, to rediscover the solid ground within. Sharing our thoughts and temptations openly with at least one other person enables us to become familiar with the desires and conflicts that drive our behavior. And listening to and accepting the reality of ourselves renders us more aware, more caring toward others. One reason for sharing with others is quite simply that most of us are harsher critics of ourselves, striking the most painful blows against ourselves at just the time when we most require tolerance and compassion, virtues that certainly characterized the two Gaza elders. And while confiding in another person or obedience goes against the grain to much in our contemporary notions of liberation or independence, when someone is unable to build up from even the smallest patch of solid ground, then the terms like freedom or free will have very little resonance. So what if you feel free when you're not healed? And frequently citing Galatians 6:2, the most commonly cited passage from Scripture in the letters, Barsanuphius and John emphasize that assuming responsibility, bearing the burdens of others, is critical to learning silence. Acknowledging responsibility for the consequences of one's thoughts and actions implies not blaming others, but bearing the burden of others. Letter 185. To come to perfect silence, one must first endure insults from other people and despise and dishonor and hurt in order that the labor may not be in vain, quoting from 1 Thessalonians. So silence is the alphabet of the language of love for these elders, because the steamroller of our words can sometimes crush intimacy. Abba John observes, as for the silence of which the fathers speak, you do not even know what this is. In fact, not many people know. For this silence is not a matter of shutting one's mouth. Someone may speak tens of thousands of words that are useful, and this is reckoned as silence. And another may utter only one idle word, and this is reckoned as trampling the Saviour's teachings. Letter 554. And finally, one final point about silence. Abba John refers to the concept of non-silence, to asiopiton, as he calls it, when one is silent but doesn't honestly manifest one's thoughts, isn't fully open in opening up to another person, and therefore remains unhealed. So both silence and speaking can be false. When our spiritual life, and especially when our spiritual talk, is disconnected from others, when it doesn't relate to this world, it's a false language. It's a miscommunication. Barsanuphius and John have little tolerance for spiritual chatter, as they call it in letter 36. Chatter that renders God small and manageable. They don't offer a recipe book for healing and salvation, seductive as any quick fix may be. Barsanuphius and John know all too well that human beings are unpredictable, far too complex for this approach to bear long-term benefits. That's not a feature I find too often in the tradition. It's certainly not a feature I find too often in contemporary spiritual direction. The more possible it is to predict someone, the less of a real person one has become. Beware the person who always has the answer. Finally, stillness, that I would call the resurrection of the soul. Solitude and silence issue in the mystery of stillness, that moment when we realize that God is the ground of our being. God is the solid rock of our foundation, letter 345. God is the one before whom we are no longer ashamed of being frail, or indeed afraid of being nothing, letter 604. For Abba John, wherever there is stillness, there also God dwells, letter 454. Stillness relates very closely to death. It reflects our expectation of the age to come. Be vigilant, advises St. Barsanuphius. Pay attention to yourself and expect your impending death. In fact, stillness can almost feel like being dead, closely resembling the slow, silent growth of roots spreading deep in the ground, furtive but formative. Barsanuphius likens perfect stillness to the arrival of a ship in a harbour where it no longer fears dangers, distress, or the onset of winds. Think of my monk on the boat on the way back to Piraeus. So, living life to the full comes only when the ultimate concerns of life, death, have been faced. Meaninglessness, desperation, death. How we face or avoid these concerns has profound consequences on our experience of life, of solitude, of silence, of stillness. Remembrance of death is a crucial virtue in the spiritual life, a daily, a tangible reminder of our weakness, of our imperfection. If we want to come out of life nice and polished, we need simply think of death. There's hardly an outwardly sense of perfection in nursing homes and hospices. Remembrance of death allows brokenness to be revealed truthfully so that the lie that heaven is elsewhere may split wide open and healing may begin. But stillness is not ultimately something scary. Actually, it's something sacred. Stillness is associated with that desire for life in abundance beyond mere survival. Most of us deny the relationship between death and stillness by entering a whirl of activity and achievement that render death improbable, maybe even impossible, we think, in our minds. Stillness is like marking time, not killing time. It's like waiting respectfully, reverently, before even the most frightening experience of failure and isolation and suffering and death. It's a renewing sense of anticipation in the newness of life. In stillness, we're aware of being alive, not dead, of having needs and temptations, and of being able to face these, embrace these without turning elsewhere. In stillness, we're not empty, we're not alone, we're not afraid. In stillness, we know, as the psalmist says, that God is, an experience that may occur in a split instant or take shape over an entire lifetime. And finally, stillness introduces what I would call an apophatic element to the way of intimacy and love. Because through stillness comes the refreshing suggestion of approaching others by not knowing them. If we are fixed to our preconceptions of others, our fears of other people, we may never enjoy perfect silence, the way it's talked about in letter 6 or 496. Because when we know someone, we've already shut our eyes to that person's constant process of change and growth. We limit ourselves by rooting others in the past and not rejoicing in their potential. And so in the isolation of solitude, we can risk being who we are, and in the echo of silence, we can risk facing the other person as he or she is, and in the intimacy of stillness, we can embrace that other person in his or her entirety, in his or her eternal dimension, beyond, far beyond what we could ever comprehend or tolerate. But let me close. There's a legend preserved in the Historia Ecclesiastica of Evagrius Scholasticus. The legend says that at the time of Evagrius' writing, we're talking around 593, some 50 years after the presumed death of the great old man, Parsonophius, the great man was believed to be still alive. And when the Patriarch of Jerusalem ordered the cell door open in order to dispel pious rumors, the story tells of a consuming fire flashing out of the cell. It seems that the silence of Parsonophius proved stronger than death itself. Solitude and silence and stillness. Three fundamental virtues that present us with subtle but significant movements of the heart. Parsonophius and John offer us fresh, nuanced perspectives of silence, emphasizing that we can only be authentically attached when we've become completely detached, the way Evagrius speaks. It's essentially the art of letting go and of trusting. It's the ability to forget oneself, as they would say, in an effort to reach out to another person. And moreover, solitude, silence, and stillness relate to every detail, letter 52 says, to every matter and conduct and concern. Every relationship demands the same closeness and separateness, the same acceptance, the same space. That's the meaning of their advice in letter 173, to be with others as if not being with them, which reminds us, of course, of the words of Evagrius that I referred to at the outset of this evening's presentation, that the monk is the one who is apart from all, and yet a part of all. I found the same inspiration in a poem entitled Sitting on the Fence by a cartoonist, fellow Australian, called Michael Lunig. And I close with his words. "Come, sit down beside me," I said to myself. And although it doesn't make sense, I held my own hand as a small sign of trust. And together, I sat alone on the fence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father John, for your stimulating, thought-provoking presentation. We're all enriched by what you've given us this evening. And now Father John will take questions from the audience.
Silence is a good thing, but to ask a question, you need to break that somehow.
I have a practical question. I've often been told that my concern is too much about doing instead of just being, and this was an excellent talk for the solitude and the silent and the stillness. Any practical tips on how I can be less concerned about doing, even when it's having to learn more about the faith and reading more and always out there trying to help and do, other than maybe learning that just being? I'm probably that Martha instead of that Mary.
If you're Martha, that's very good. No, that's a good question. I don't know what the answer to that is, honestly. I know what I try to do. I know that we try far too often to avoid silence. We so easily turn to anything, even in church circles. We turn to doing things, saying things, hearing things in church, filling gaps of silence in church. Or people who want to pray will always hold something, pull out a Bible, pull out a prayer book, pull out a prayer rope. Always doing something, and all of these are good things to help us reach the moment of silence. But there's a sense in which you need to move also beyond that and need to stop. I know that Father Emilianos on Mount Athos, the abbot formerly of Simonos Petra Monastery, liked to emphasize the silence of the night. And certainly in monastic circles, that's the quiet time when nothing is happening, depending on what part of the world you live. But certainly where I am now in Maine, it's pretty quiet after 5, 6 p.m. And you can be silent. The night has something, I think, innate that gives birth to opportunities for silence. But the truth is that in our busy schedules, we also have opportunities for silence, and we tend to fill them. I mean, it's very easy to learn a little silence when you're stuck in traffic in New York or stuck at an airport. At LaGuardia, there are God-given opportunities. You can panic, of course, about connecting flights, but when all that's done, there is time for silence. There are opportunities. But I think we are afraid of learning to let go and be silent. I've learned a little more about silence, practically speaking, through my son's physical disability. My son, Julian, can't walk. He has cerebral palsy. And he knows what it is not to have something. Because I know that this life, we're expected to have things and to achieve things and to be productive and to be successful. That's certainly the track I was always on in terms of where my studies were leading me and where my career was leading me and so forth. But Julian taught me to slow down. You can't hurry when you're with Julian. You literally can't hurry out of the house when you're with Julian. You can't hurry anywhere, rush out of the house. You can't rush to an appointment when you're with Julian. There's always lots of time. And he's very comfortable about the time that it takes. Usually very concerned about the fact that I'm stressing out, but he's normally very comfortable. And I think he gets that, honestly, through a kind of a life experience that gives him a wisdom that I don't know that I could ever get from books, certainly even from Barsanufis and John. Once when I was teaching at Holy Cross in the theological seminary, the Greek Orthodox seminary in Boston, I remember in my first years there deciding to take a class that I was teaching on silence, in fact, to take them to a nearby monastery just outside of Boston in Spencer, a monastery that is very ecumenical and would receive us. And I thought that the students should go there one time just to spend a day of silence. And I remember saying that, and I would do this once a year, the aim was to do nothing there. I was not going to teach them anything. They were going to attend the morning service and then be completely silent through the day. And then in the evening, close with the prayer of the monastics and head home. No teaching, no reading, right? I allow them sort of to be outside and just walk around, but already that's distraction enough. The idea was to experience what silence was about. And I remember one time, I think it was the second time that I was there, I decided to take the school bus. And I was actually thrilled that everyone in the school was so, happy that I would take the bus. I wondered why everyone was so happy. No one told me that the bus was actually on the verge of breaking down. So here we were, headed off to Spencer, about an hour outside of Boston, with about 15 or so students in a small bus. And my son Julian was coming with us that year. Previous year I'd taken Alexander. And Julian said, I want to come this year. He was 7 years old. And I remember saying to him, look, it's not going to be fun. I mean, he knew the students. This was going to be a fun outing for him. I said, it won't be fun. They'll be doing nothing all day. So there's no point in coming. But he knew, of course, which buttons to press. He said, well, last year you took your other son. So I ended up taking Julian with me. Well, sure enough, half an hour into our trip on the pike, and the bus breaks down. And I remember our student, who's now a priest, I think, in New York, Dimitri, turned to me and said, Father John, what are we going to do? Can you gather us and teach us something, talk to us? And I said, Dimitri, I think we should call AAA. And we did. We called AAA. Well, they were going to take 3 or 4 hours. We were no emergency by any stretch of the imagination. So we were going to spend 3 or 4 hours on the side of the road doing nothing. And so I did gather them, and I said, well, what do you feel about the fact that we're doing nothing? We're actually failing in what we aimed to do. We were headed to a monastery to experience silence and maybe, I don't know, see the divine light, and all of a sudden we can't do that. We're sitting on the side of the road on the turnpike, stuck for several hours. We're not going to do anything. At best, the bus will be fixed and we'll head back home. And each of the students went around and discussed what their feeling was about what was happening that day. Julian was sitting next to me, and I thought I'd ask him, 7 years old. And I said, what do you feel about the fact that you're going out with us and you won't do anything today? We're going to sit here for several hours and we're going to go home. And he said to me, I feel lucky. Lucky, he said. I guess in theological jargon I could have said blessed. He said lucky. I feel lucky. I said, why lucky? This is not going to be a fun day for you. It's not going to be what you thought it would be. He said, well, because, Dad, you know how sometimes we go on drives and we see people along the side of the road whose cars have broken down? I've always wondered inside my brain what those people feel. And now I know. And I said, I'm impressed that you could take something that's negative, a loss, and actually see it as something that is a gain spiritually. And you can be happy. And he corrected me. He said, I didn't say I'm happy. He said, I'm lucky. I think it was his legs that were talking, really. It's not the wisdom of a 7-year-old boy. It was that he knew what it was not to have. And we need to find ways of remembering what I said earlier, that what we don't have is also what connects us with one another, and it connects us ultimately with God. Our imperfections, our failures, not what we say or what we do, not what we achieve, not our successes, not our degrees, not our careers. They actually divide us. Where I studied, what I do for work, what someone else does for work. They're differences that we have. Hopefully they fit into community. The fact that I've struggled with illness, the fact that I've struggled with suffering, the fact that I've known arrogance and pride, the fact that I've lost someone or something, the fact that there's been breakdown or break up, that connects me with other people. That actually teaches me, it doesn't teach me to love, that's what makes me a compassionate person. And I think that's where we begin to learn the language of silence as well. So if we see that silence as that space that I was talking about, that nothing, what St. Gregory Palamas says so beautifully, that we're all called to be sponges, he says. What's a sponge? It's a nothing. It's air. And in fact, the more air, the more nothing a sponge is, the better it is. The more valuable, the better the quality of that sponge. That's what we're called to achieve in the spiritual life. Becoming children again, not growing up spiritually, as Abba Isaiah would say, of Skeetus. That's the aim of the spiritual life. So learning to be silent and not doing is part of the same context of living.
I I was very struck by the paradox of intention in your talk when you were saying you go apart to be a part. And I know that that's a common theme in a lot of world religions. And I'm just curious. I mean, I know how I would answer this question, but I'm curious to hear you respond to the question of what is it that makes that paradox of intention different in the desert experience or in the patristic experience than, say, the Buddhist experience, when the whole idea of sunyata is very similar to the exact thing that you're talking about, loss of self, emptying yourself so that you can, sponge-like, participate in the world in a much larger way. So I know as a Christian what I should say to that answer, but I'm not really looking for a doctrinal answer. I mean, I really am struggling to, when I talk to people of other religious traditions and they say things like, well, Christianity says the same thing as, a lot of these New Age religions, particularly when we talk about an experience like this, and it's what is the kernel there that sets that paradox apart?
Well, it's a good question. If you want doctrine from me, you're not going to get it. I think we should ask Father Tom. That's not my field at all. But look, I guess first of all I might say that where there are, or when there are, where there might be similarities, doesn't frighten me. That's a first thing that I think I need to say, because we tend to want to almost distinguish ourselves where we're actually different, just in case people don't know what our flag and its colours are. I'm not as frightened, if you like, of connections that can be made. Some of those connections are very human connections. I mean, it's very true to say that monasticism is not a Christian phenomenon. There's a very clear development in the Christian history, but it's not a Christian phenomenon alone. It was there before Christ, and it's there in all, I think, religions as a practice, as a rigor, a discipline. It's a response almost to a universal yearning for growth through silence and through charity, through love, compassion. So that's a first thought that I have in response. A second is to say that not too many religions, I think, speak of the cross the way we do. I know Nietzsche might have been uncomfortable with it, but the reality is that the emphasis on the cross, which is certainly there in Saints Bartholomew and John, certainly there in the earlier tradition, going right back to the Desert Fathers, that speak of the whole of the aim of the Christian life as basically standing beneath the cross, or Abba Isaiah of Sketis, who speaks of not just bearing the cross, but actually being raised onto the cross, mounting the cross, as he puts it, in his various stages of the spiritual life. That emphasis of not just seeing God beyond or through the struggle or the suffering, but actually seeing God in the very heart of the suffering, which I think is exactly what the symbol of the cross and the theology of the cross is about. That I don't find in too many other places. That I think is uniquely Christian. And then the emphasis that you don't find in too many of the Desert Fathers, but that you do find in Saints Bartholomew and John, the emphasis on the communion or the compassion that we are to experience through silence. The emphasis on that being not just related to, but almost identified with the communion of the persons of the Holy Trinity, that's where it all stems from. That's the source of our compassion, of our communion, of our understanding of love through silence. That, I think, too, is a fairly unique feature. But I'm curious as to how you would respond. You said you had a response, so why did you put me on the spot? Tell me later.
Thanks so much for your comments and reflections. I've recently read Mother Teresa's Come Be My Light, her letters, and her comments about that icy cold silence from God. And your reference to the cross always implies that moment for Jesus when he experiences that deep silence from God. Could you comment on that in light of the Desert Fathers?
I'm not familiar with the
Sure.
book, the letters, in fact, or the phrase you said is, sorry, again, the icy?
She experiences an icy cold silence from
Icy
God
cold
for
silence.
years in her prayers. After experiencing a great depth of actually hearing the voice of Christ calling her to establish the missionaries of charity, then the voice goes silent. And in the sense of she never quite understands that silence, even through her spiritual directors with the dark night. It just never,
Right.
there's no consolation in that. But then when you think of that silence that Jesus experiences in Mark, that abandonment, is there any comment on the silence of God, which is a strangely profound communication, but only if you look at it at a distance? Yeah?
No, thank you for that. I think that if you're looking for similarities, you'll probably find them in the more, to characterize them in this way, which is not always the best way, but the more mystical of the fathers. You will find those sorts of references in, say, St. Simeon the New Theologian. You'll find less of the emphasis on that mystical, say, experience of God in the desert tradition or in Bartholomew and John. In fact, this is something that strikes me as being something quite unique in Bartholomew and John, that they are not at least not primarily, the sort of charismatic elders that one would expect of them. They certainly don't see themselves in that way. And that's probably because the desert tradition also seemed to be a break, this xenitia, this estrangement or renunciation, not just of material things and not just of people, of other human beings running off to the desert. The desert experience was also a kind of a renunciation of any kind of conventional understanding of authority or knowledge or mysticism or charisma in the church. In a sense, they were moving away, turning their backs to anything that would identify with that. And by doing so, what they did, of course, in their eccentricity, they were, of course, drawing our attention away from what we tend to do, which is often look for these mystical experiences and so forth. I mean, the Eastern tradition in general differs a little in this respect, but certainly with the Desert Fathers and people like Bartholomew and John that continue the tradition of the Desert Fathers, there's a renunciation of any kind of... they did not see themselves as pillars of knowledge or authority or wisdom or charisma. And that's exactly what rendered them, quite paradoxically, the center of attraction for those who sought knowledge and wisdom and charisma.
Thank you, Father. If I might take you back to your opening remarks, because I somehow am still there with you on that ship bouncing 20 feet in the air and coming down on the waves, and yet you were so struck by the posture of the monk who really maintained a sense of composure, to put it mildly, in the midst of all of that. And that evoked the question in me, perhaps if you could share with us wisdom of the masters regarding the experience of let me say, in interior solitude, interior silence, interior stillness, that the world around us is extremely chaotic and noisy, and yet there seems to be some secret, let us say, of the wisdom out of which they teach that we might benefit from in the modern world if we want to try to come to lives that are more still. I think a line keeps going through my mind from the four quartets of T.S. Eliot: at the still point of the turning world, there the dance is. Thank you.
Do you know what the name of the monk was on the boat? His name was Father Isichios. His name means silence. Still remember him. I approached him to ask his name. I guess to connect again with what I was trying to do, at least in my presentation this evening, to connect how silence relates to the way we treat others or the way we understand the world. To connect how silence ultimately is this deep experience of humility, ultimately, where the saint takes himself or herself less seriously and takes God more seriously, and in doing so puts his or her ultimate trust in God, so that in a sense, no matter what the saint does is fine, whether he or she speaks or whether is silent. Then it is a dance. Then it is like a child playing in the confidence, that trust of a father or a mother, so that almost anything goes, because we know we'll get it wrong, but we know deep down that in trusting God, God will set it right. So there's this connection between humility and love, and this sort of self-knowledge and this opening up to others, to the point where if you've learned to be silent, then, how does the saint put it? Everyone will find peace around you. Now, Anthony Bloom, in his book, School for Prayer, talks about the practice of silence and how you can actually do something to lead a life of silence. And he says that find a time, find a place, he says, when there's nothing else going on in your life. A time, in the evening, as we were saying, when you can, shut off the phone, no television, no radio, no CNN, nothing. When it's just you and God, he says, almost repeating Barsanuphius and John and Abba Alonius. You and God are alone in this world. Spend time in complete silence, he says. And he goes on, this goes on in the description of this practice over 2 or 3 pages in Anthony Bloom's book. And he says, after a curiously short period of time, you will learn something very important about silence. Because after only a few minutes of being silent, you will most likely feel bored, he says. And by feeling bored, he says, you've already learned something very important. You've learned that if after only a few minutes of being completely silent, you feel bored, is it any wonder that those around you feel bored with you? Which connects silence so immediately with the world around us, with what's happening around us, and with whom we're relating to around us. So going in is not just a practice. Ultimately, it's an attitude of humility. It's going down, if you like. It's mounting the cross. It's bearing the cross, which for these elders, Barsanuphius and John, is tantamount to bearing the burdens of others. It's identifying with your neighbor. It's loving your neighbor as yourself. And then you learn to love God. Thank you for your silence.